We begin today with a fun fact that you may have seen on the internet. 1 in every 200 men alive today is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Has anyone seen this floating around on Facebook, Reddit, or like? Okay, you guys get outside more than I do. I see it, this comes across my feed like several times every year. But what this is saying is that Genghis Khan was so prolific across the territories he conquered that he personally fathered something like 16 million people. Well, contrary to what you may have heard about everything on the internet being true, it turns out that this particular internet fun fact is not true at all. In a study published just last month, researchers pulled DNA from the tombs of Mongol rulers from Kazakhstan, and the numbers don't add up. They're not even close. And here's a real kicker, is that Genghis Khan's tomb has never actually been found. No one actually had his DNA to begin with, and so the original fun fact was just an educated guess that the internet just kind of decided was true. So the story that we tell about Genghis Khan as a lusty and a bloodthirsty conqueror turns out to be almost entirely myth. And instead, what enabled his rise to international fame and conquest was his rather inspired application of Mongol hunting techniques to military campaigns. So when they're hunting, the Mongols practice something called the nurge. And here's how it worked. Thousands of warriors on horseback would spread out in a line across the steppe, sometimes covering a full day's journey in each direction. They would then spend weeks tightening that line into a circle, driving all the game in the area into a circle, a central area where they would be killed en masse, and their meat and their furs would be preserved to get people through the harsh Mongolian winters. And so what Genghis Khan did is he took the nurge, that massive coordinated encircling movement, and he applied it directly to military conquest. He used the same maneuver to surround and conquer army after army and city after city and country after country until he had amassed the largest contiguous land empire in human history. What is more, 3 generations later after Genghis Khan, the nurge was still in use by his grandson, a guy by the name of Kublai. But by that time, it had morphed into something else altogether. You see, Kublai Khan was, and there's no really delicate way of saying it, so I'm just going to come out and say, he was extraordinarily obese, to the extent that he could not be carried by a horse. He also suffered badly from gout from all the wine that he drank and the rich foods that he ate. And so what he did was this. He had for himself built a room, like an actual room with walls and a ceiling and a bed and comfortable seating and a table at which to drink his wine and eat his rich foods. And he then had that room strapped to the back of 4 elephants. This is true. Here's an artist's depiction of what it looked like. And so rather than joining his men in the nurge formation and helping them tighten the circle like his grandfather had, Kublai was carried in this well-appointed room by those 4 elephants to the center where he waited for his warriors to drive the game toward him. And then, when the moment was right, servants would roll back the roof of his room, and some falconers would send their birds out to catch game, while Kublai sat and watched, not raising a finger to do anything, but claiming credit for the hunt. So while the nurge in its original form was a life-giving and world-changing tradition, over time, over the course of generations, it had become a caricature of itself. And as it happens, that is exactly the kind of thing that we see in this morning's reading from chapter 13 of the Gospel of Luke. So in our story this morning, we were told that Jesus was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath day when he encounters a woman who had been bent over double for 18 years. Without a moment's hesitation, he calls her over to him, speaks some words over her, touches her, and poof, just like that, she is able to stand upright again for the first time in 18 years. Indisputably, this is a good thing. This is an amazing thing. It is a miracle in every sense of the word. And yet, the leader of the synagogue immediately takes issue with what Jesus had done. He reminds Jesus that there are 6 days of the week that are meant for work. And so if this woman wanted to be healed so badly, she should have come to the synagogue on one of those days, because the seventh day, the Sabbath day, that was meant only for rest. Now, while from our perspective, the synagogue leader is being very small-minded, it's important to keep in mind that the command to rest on the Sabbath, which is actually the fourth of the 10 commandments, this command was not just an arbitrary rule. This was not religious busywork. This was not God being fussy. Rather, this was a commandment that was originally born out of liberation. Because just think about what the Israelites had come through when they first received it. They had just spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt. That's 400 years of endless labor, 400 years of being treated not as humans, but as tools to build somebody else's empire. And so once the Israelites were free, God gave them what was a radical command. Stop. One day in 7, everyone stops. Not just the rich, not just the landowners, but everyone. The servants, the foreigners living among you, even your animals, just stop and rest. And I think it's easy for us to see how that would have been a life-giving and world-changing tradition for these former slaves. Far from being experienced as an arbitrary rule, it would have been received as a gift, as an affirmation that they are not tools put on earth to do someone else's bidding, but human beings made in God's own image and deserving of rest. Like, truly, that is a beautiful thing. But then over time, the religious leaders did what people do. They took that one beautiful command to rest, and they started asking questions about it and elaborating on it. And it started reasonably enough, I think. If you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, what counts as work exactly? If something catches fire, are you allowed to put it out? What if your animal needs water? What if you need to cook? But over the course of generations, what those questions yielded was 39 separate categories of work that were prohibited on the Sabbath. 39 categories of work. Here they are. Carrying, burning, extinguishing, finishing, writing, erasing, cooking, washing, sewing, tearing, knotting, untying, shaping, plowing, planting, reaping, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, selecting, sifting, grinding, kneading, combing, spinning, dyeing, chain stitching, warping, weaving, unraveling, building, demolishing, trapping, shearing, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, smoothing, and marking, obviously. So there's 39 categories of work, each with its own interpretations, each with its own subcategories, each with its own exceptions. So that single, beautiful, liberating command to rest had become a legal labyrinth. So when the synagogue leader complains that Jesus healed the woman on the Sabbath, his issue is that this healing fell within one of these 39 categories of prohibited work. And in case you were wondering, and even if you weren't, I want you to know that because the work of healing at the time involved a lot of different roots and herbs that needed to be ground up to make different salves and poultices, the prohibition against healing on the Sabbath actually fell under the prohibition against grinding. Who would have thunk? But there you go. But that is how technical and granular this system had become. But in response to the synagogue leader's complaint, Jesus doesn't launch into a legal argument. He doesn't cite chapter and verse. He just points to something that everyone in the room already knew. He simply says, "You hypocrites." each of you works on the Sabbath. Don't you untie your ox or your donkey from its stall and lead it out for water? So in other words, they had written provisions into this legal labyrinth to make sure their animals didn't go thirsty on the Sabbath. But this woman, this daughter of Abraham held in bondage for 18 years, that's where they decided to hold the line. The donkey's thirst covered, 18 years of suffering, come back during normal business hours. This tradition that had been born to say that no human being should ever again be crushed under the weight of someone else's empire was now being used to keep a suffering woman right where she was. Just like Kublai and his elephants, what was originally a life-giving and world-changing tradition had become a caricature of itself. And in a lot of ways, this is the perfect story for us to be reading about and learning about this morning. Because this is not just a story about first century Judaism. This is a story about us. About what happens to every community, every institution, every church when we stop asking whether our traditions are still serving people or whether the people have started serving the traditions. Because when we stop asking that, we end up like Kublai strapped to 4 elephants calling it a hunt. We end up like the synagogue leader watering his donkey on the Sabbath, but telling a suffering woman to come back tomorrow. And so it is no accident that we are sitting here with this story on a morning when we are going to welcome new members into this community. Because there is nothing like a fresh set of eyes to help a community see itself clearly. New people ask questions that the rest of us stopped asking years ago, like, why do we do it this way? What is this for? Does this even make sense? These are not threatening questions, rather these are the most important questions that a community can be asked. Because when we keep asking them, we remain the kind of community that looks up from its rules and its traditions long enough to notice who is standing right there in front of us. And somewhere in this room, or somewhere right outside our doors, there is someone who has been bent over for a long time, just waiting to be seen, waiting to be called forward, waiting to find out whether this is the kind of place where they can find healing. And so in a few moments, when we ask you, the congregation, as part of that new member ceremony, whether you welcome these new members into the communal life of this church, and whether you recognize that their presence and participation will forever change the shape of this community and help it grow in new ways, I want you to really hear what you are being asked. You are being asked to stay open, to stay curious, to keep asking questions yourself, and to receive new questions from others, not as a threat, but as exactly what they are. A gift. Because that is how something life-giving and world-changing as Jesus' gospel of love avoids becoming a caricature and instead keeps giving life and keeps changing the world. In this place and in this people, may it be so.